Hi, and welcome to the Podcast Business Lunch. I'm Brad Hill. Today I speak with Bryan Moffett. He's the Chief Operating Officer of National Public Media, the nationwide sales and sponsorship development organization of NPR. And he has also recently been named to head up the recently announced NPR Network Growth Team. We talk about this initiative and what it hopes to accomplish throughout this decade. The Podcast Business Lunch is sponsored by NPR and also by Triton Digital, two leaders in the field, and here are their messages.
This lunch is sponsored by NPR, a leader in audio journalism and storytelling for over 50 years. NPR delivers international, national, and local news and programming to audiences via radio, podcasts, and digital platforms. NPR offers brand sponsors an effective and measurable opportunity to connect with its 138 million monthly users who rely on the trusted and valued content provided by 35 news bureaus around the world and hundreds of public media member stations in communities across the country. NPR resonates with listeners and creates a compelling, uncluttered environment for your brand to do the same.
Triton Digital is the global technology and services leader to the digital audio and podcast industry. Triton provides innovative technology to broadcasters and podcasters to build their audience, maximize revenue, and streamline their day-to-day operations. In addition, Triton powers the global online audio industry with Webcast Metrics, the leading online audio measurement service, and Podcast Metrics, one of the first IAB-certified podcast measurement services in the industry. To learn more, visit us at tritondigital.com.
We're proud and grateful to be sponsored by NPR and Triton Digital. It's essential support, and without it, we would not be able to produce the Podcast Business Lunch. And now, here's my conversation with Bryan Moffett. Bryan, it's great to see you again, and thanks for making the time to do this.
No problem. Good to see you again, too. A lot going on.
You are the Chief Operating Officer of National Public Media, the nationwide sales and sponsorship development organization of NPR. That is an encompassing and influential role. As if it weren't enough, you have recently been appointed, or perhaps coerced, I don't know how it happened, to take on the leadership role of the NPR Network Growth Team. I've read a little bit about this, but there's not much information, so I'm delighted to talk to you and learn more. Please tell me, from whatever angle you want, what is the mission of the NPR Network Growth Team?
So I asked for the job, to be clear. It wasn't given to me. It was an outgrowth of a lot of work that I've been doing over the course of the pandemic with NPR, as we looked at the business and we looked at the business model and tried to understand what was happening. And I think it's a confluence of two things. One is the podcast business, which has been fueling a lot of our sponsorship growth, has gotten a lot harder over the past year or two. And I think I've heard that from a lot of my colleagues in the industry. There's just saturation, big players coming into the space. So, I think part of this came about as I looked around at the business that I'm responsible for as the COO of NPM, trying to think of where does this business need to go in 2 or 3 years. It was looking harder and harder for NPR to just try to go it alone as a publisher in the space. On the other side, we've been working a lot with the station network at NPR about what does it mean to be a digital network. We have a business model that goes back 50 years from the founding of NPR. And for that first 50 years, it was anchored around our radio relationship. Mm-hmm. And it worked. We had a great relationship with the audience, with each other, and the business model worked. There was radio programming that came out of the stations as a distributor of the radio programs, and NPR created a lot of the radio programs, and we shared a sponsorship opportunity, and they were the ones who got the support from the listeners, and they used some of that money to pay NPR. It all worked wonderful. And I like to think of it as, when you think of the radio dial, it was a unifying factor for NPR and stations. Just through that one signal came everything, whether it was WAMU or NPR or American Public Media. That was the conduit for it. When you move into the digital world, you kind of lose that, particularly in the podcast space. So NPR has been very fortunate to have a growing and large podcast audience and business. And I think we were an early driver of that. But stations, some have found success, some have had a harder road. But if you look at the landscape of public media podcasts, it's NPR, it's APM, it's WNYC, and there's no unifying factor, right? It's just a bunch of organizations creating similar content. So, as part of thinking about what this might look like, we got together with a lot of station leaders over the past year who are also thinking about this. And we tried to think through what would a network look like in the digital age. And just about 2 weeks ago, we kind of announced our first pass at this across public media, which is the NPR Network Initiative. And it's basically a framework for how NPR and stations can work together to create more affinities and engagement with digital audiences. One of the big challenges we have in public media as a business model is the people who support their stations, they're predominantly radio listeners. If you look at the kind of segmentation of the audience, the people who are primarily radio listeners, a large proportion of them support their local station. And then if you look on the other end of the spectrum with people who are generally podcast listeners or just NPR digital audiences, very few of them do because they don't understand the relationship and the model. So with the NPR Network Initiative, we have two very big goals that we're announcing. One is by 2030, we want to double the number of people directly supporting a local station, an NPR network partner. And we want to double the amount of revenue in the system. So that's by the end of 2030. We got a lot of time to do it, but the network growth team and the team I'm going to be leading on that side is responsible for what I like to call the digital underpinnings of this strategy, how we're going to use our digital content, our digital platforms, and digital tools to meet those goals and to deliver more engagement to the younger, diverse audiences we need to hit and have become fans of public media, and then take the next step to support the system through becoming a member or a donor to their local station. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I think if we get this right, and this is not just NPR, this is the stations and NPR all having to do this together, it'll also help my other role as COO of NPM, because our audiences will be growing and the sponsorship opportunity will be growing, and we can all make more money, which is not a bad thing in public media. The more money we have, it means the more we can deliver on our mission and the more people we can reach and impact.
Not sure nutshell is the correct container for this vast vision, but it was well stated and concise. I madly took notes, but probably didn't catch everything. So it seems to me unification, that's a key theme here. Audience growth, and with a particular emphasis on youthful segments of the audience, and podcasting and digital listening and connecting that with the network. So the next logical question is how, but that might be too broad. If it is too broad, then I guess a more specific question would be, how will you interact with and work with the hundreds of local NPR stations around the country to get this vision moving from the ground up?
Yeah, and I think the one word I challenge a little bit is unification. I mean, the brands and the power of the local stations in their communities is not something that we're looking to lose. In fact, it's something we're looking to harness. So, I think the best way to think about what the NPR network would look like, it's a place where brands like NPR or WAMU or WNYC can kind of live as brands, but we're all part of a larger thing called the NPR network. So people can understand how we're related. And then through that, we can also do things to help grow everybody's business and revenue. So
a branding exercise might be a way of putting it?
A branding exercise is a very good way to put it. And there's a lot of different nuances to this too. There are some stations who have very strong local brands. And, I think they're like, oh, I don't want to give that up. We spent decades building that and they shouldn't have to give that up. But we're hoping by adding on the affiliation to the network, they can add value and make it clear to the digital audiences that, oh, these are all related. And if I support one, I'm helping the other. And increasingly, as we make more content and do some of the things we're about to talk about, it will become even more apparent that we are related.
Okay, so how does it get started? Are all the stations even aware of this now, that it's coming at them?
They are. So we put an announcement out to the system, I'd say 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then last week, there was an event, the Public Radio Super Regional in Denver. So we had a couple of sessions there to talk to people. And in fact, just before this call, we hosted our first system-wide webinar to talk to stations about it at a very high level. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to it, and there's a lot of pieces to it that all may not, you may not see how they all fit together, and they may not even be the right pieces. We may have to adapt as we go, but that's kind of where we are, is starting the discussion with the system.
How big is your team? I know Joel's involved somehow.
Yeah, Joel Zuckerman is on the team. He is the vice president of audio platform strategy. And then on his team, he's got two people, Dan McCoy, who's a business development director, and Lita Moritz, who is working on the Plus. She's the program manager for NPR Plus. That's it right now. We're a pretty lean, scrappy team. But I think one of the changes that John Lansing has been trying to make happen across NPR is, there's been some silos in different divisions of NPR where things have been controlled. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is have sort of the strategy for something be owned in one place in collaboration with other stakeholders, but the execution can live in other places in the org. And so we're a small team, but a couple of the key pieces of the network initiative, we will be overseeing the strategy for and making sure that they're achieving the goals that we outlined.
So audience building, revenue building, those are broad mission pillars, it seems to me, and youth and diversity in the audience, I think, too. How does that get accomplished, or at least started?
So I'll go over a couple of pieces, and keep me honest here, because I'll probably meander on any one of them, because I could talk for a long time. I think one of the things that's most apparent, because it's already out in the market, is NPR Plus. So we actually got into what we call NPR Plus, I think it was almost a year ago when Apple launched subscriptions. And I view what we've done so far as phase one. So we've gone show by show and created the ability for a super fan of a Planet Money or a Code Switch to use the Apple or Spotify platform, or we have our own platform powered by Supporting Cast, where they can pay the fee to get rid of the ads. Simple as that. It's a way to support the show, but it's also a way to get an enhanced version of the product. Our core benefit has been ad-free. We are just exploring a little bit around insider content. We don't ever want to be a paywall. That's not consistent with public media. But I think we can provide a better experience for the super fans with content that is really only relevant to the super fans. As an example, Jay Williams, The Limits with Jay Williams, you can get the ad-free version. And then on Fridays, he publishes a little extra segment just for the insiders. So it's just kind of like a thought from Jay. So it's not the core content, but it's the kind of thing super fans enjoy.
It seems roughly similar to asking listeners for contributions, and then they get a gift.
Sort of, but that's a very contentious thing, because the business model of public media is that stations have been the B2C entity, and NPR is more of a B2B entity. And in fact, by our board bylaws, we're prohibited from taking kind of donations, small donations or membership from people. That is the domain of the stations.
Right. Okay. So, I see that clear division. Yeah. So with NPR Plus, you're selling something.
It's more of a transactional product. It's pay a little bit of money to choose to, support it directly versus listening via ads. But that's the limit of it. And we're not trying to create a deep relationship with those people. Aside from, if we get their permission, we want to try to introduce them to local stations so that they can understand the benefit of the system and how it all works. And hopefully we can guide some of these people to become station members. But that's phase one. And I will also say a portion of the net revenue we're setting aside to benefit stations as well, because that's really important to NPR. But this was just to get some learning on how the subscription business works, how we can do it. It's a lot of work, frankly.
When it started and I saw you jumping into it, saw NPR jumping into it, I wondered whether this was just a box that needed to be checked and then move on, or whether there was deeper thought. Now I'm seeing that there is deeper thought to it. How is it going?
It's going pretty well. I will say two ways. One is we had set a target of 1% of our engaged audience taking us up on a subscription offering, and we've exceeded that. Some shows were over 2%, a few were just below, but on average it's about 1.5%. So we feel good about that, But what we've learned, I think, is the more valuable thing, which is it's hard. Getting our shows and podcasts to produce a version without the ads or the mechanisms or markers for sponsorship, which we've developed over the past decade pretty well, was a lot harder than we thought.
So it's not just selling it, it's producing it.
it's producing it. And people have a finite amount of time, so to add a little extra has been a challenge. I think the platforms are new to this as well, so we've had some struggles. It's not as easy as just like create that separate feed and you're done. I think for Apple and Spotify, you still have to kind of upload individual content episode by episode. So all that's getting better and worked out. But what we're excited about, I think, is what I think of as phase two. NPR Plus as a service will eventually take all the podcasts that are ad-free and put them in one bundle that you can get only as a benefit of being a member of a station. So if you're familiar with public media, it's
there we
kind
go.
of
There's
similar
the
to
crossover.
Passport. Yeah, like PBS Passport allows you to donate to a station at a certain level and you get access to on-demand and over-the-top versions of their programming. The model between PBS and NPR and stations are very different. I mean, those are programs that stations are paying for on the PBS side. So they're kind of just offering their members access digitally to them. NPR's podcasts are NPR's podcasts, but we're trying to figure out a way to leverage them to benefit stations so that the podcast superfans and the digital audiences say, hey, there's value there. I just need to become a member of WAMU and pay $100 a year, and then I can get all of those ad-free. And that's a good benefit, and that's worth the investment of the donation.
Okay, good. I think I'm getting somewhere in my understanding of all this. So I'm curious, what has the response been in a general way from the stations as they are introduced to this whole initiative?
Enthusiastic across the board, although there are some elements of it that kind of break that model and require some trust falls on both sides. So I think there's a lot of, I want to learn more, and we're going to dive into the details. I would say, going back to NPR Plus and the subscriptions, the initial offering of single show by show was probably viewed with a little skepticism by the system because it again broke that relationship, and NPR was actually taking transactional money from an audience member. So we did set aside some of the revenue for stations. But I think as they learned about NPR Plus, the bundle, and how that is reserved only for members of a station, that starts to make a lot more sense because they can compare it in their mind to Passport and the successes there. But NPR Plus is what I think is going to be transformative if we get this right for the system.
I also see in the press coverage around the audience growth that NPR One is mentioned quite a bit. How does that tie in, and how is it doing, by the way? I mean, it's been years since that was launched, and I sometimes wonder, how's it going? How's the audience developing?
It's going well. I would say it kind of grew and then it sort of hit a plateau, and it's been in a bit of a plateau for 3 or 4 years. And I think it's kind of been at that plateau because pandemic, that kind of threw everything out into the woods. And then I think the other thing is there was a lot of aspirations for how NPR One could support digital across the system, both NPR and stations. And I think there was a lot of promise in it. We know it's a huge driver of audience to station podcasts, also the NPR podcasts. And we've done a lot to integrate local content and localization into NPR One, but then it kind of hit a plateau because there was nothing to place it within in terms of a larger framework. And as we started developing the NPR Network initiative, like almost every discussion ended with, well, and NPR One could help with that, and NPR One could help with that. So it quickly became apparent that that is the framework where NPR One could become very, very powerful for us. Right now, we are in the middle of a unification strategy because we do have 2 apps. There's the NPR app and there's the NPR One app, and they kind of serve different audiences. NPR app is more about reading and live streams, and NPR One's more about personalization and on-demand content. So I'd say we're halfway through a process of merging those 2 into one app very carefully to make sure we don't alienate our audiences. But I think we've kind of hit the pause button on that now that we're in the middle of the NPR Network initiative, because we really think NPR One, or whatever it turns out to be at the end of this process, could become a huge engine driver for the NPR network.
I think of NPR as obviously one of the most important and voluminous and successful podcast publishers in the world. And my wife and I run a public radio household. What I notice is that these are network podcasts, and I don't hear podcasts from any of the local stations that we've been involved with. What's the status on that? And does this new initiative deal with that, or does it really not matter?
It does, and that's one of the pieces that's kind of in the network growth portfolio. We want to launch a podcast network with our stations, and we've done a lot of thinking and a lot of discussions with a handful of stations and our board, and we think there's a path forward here. Now, again, it's very careful because stations have invested a lot of time and energy in their podcast and their brand, so it's not like suddenly everything's an NPR podcast. It's not going to work for anybody, but I think under the NPR network brand, we can create kind of a framework where everything fits together and is kind of identified as being part of a larger whole. And so, I mean, practically, what would it mean? And these aren't the words because we have to go through the exercises, but it would be NPR's Planet Money is part of the NPR network. And it could be WHYY's The Pulse is part of the NPR network. So on WHYY's podcast, he had the little bug in the corner so that you indicate it's part of a network, and they just reference themselves as such. And we think just with that alone, there's tremendous power because NPR has around 50 or 60 podcasts, depending on what's in season and what's not. Across the network of our member stations, there are almost 1,000 podcasts. Now, a lot of them are small, right? Super serving a local audience. Some of them are bigger. There's a lot of successes from stations. But if you could put a wrapper around all of that and let people know that all these things are part of a larger whole, that would be powerful from a branding perspective. And then the first benefit we want to provide through that network is cross promotion. So there's not a lot of this happening. As you said, you don't hear a lot about station podcasts. But if we had this network, our goal would be to cross promote those station podcasts in the network across everything we do, not just in the podcast, but on NPR One and on NPR.org, where we have a very large audience, and we can, tailor a podcast to someone based on their interests or the geography and service a local station podcast they might never have heard about. So the goal of the podcast network is first to kind of create at least a framework that we all live within in the user's mind. And then second, to specifically grow the audience to the station podcast through a cross promotion program where our aspiration is to deliver twice as much promotional value back to the stations as they would deliver to NPR, because we would ask them to promote NPR podcasts, on the other side of the equation.
Yeah. All right. Let me veer off in a somewhat different direction. Bryan, in the past, you have been a thought leader and even a technical creator to some extent, I think, of measurement solutions, and certainly have been in the middle of all measurement discussions in the last several years when it comes to podcast measurement. Where does that whole field stand now to you? And my second question in there would be, are you friendly toward programmatic?
Those are two big questions. So I have to always start on the metric side with, I think we're in a very good place for where the industry is right now. So between the IAB and services like PodTrack and the certification programs, it's easier than ever for a buyer to kind of have a common yardstick to understand what it is they're buying across the ecosystem of podcasting. Are you IAB certified? Do you follow these certifications? And you at least have a yardstick that works across the industry. And that is great to see. I would say, and I've been very vocal about this, that is anchored around downloads, which is the best metric we can get right now, but it's probably not the best metric that could exist. The better metric would be around actual play data. I don't say listening data anymore because it's not really about that. It's more, was the content played and was it heard by a human? So, years ago, we tried to get the industry around an effort to try to solve this problem with remote audio data. That didn't go anywhere because we quickly hit up against the limits of platforms and their privacy concerns, and I would just say a lack of momentum around an eagerness for a solution. It has changed a little bit. I will say this year, the IAB has taken a much harder look at this, and we've been part of some very encouraging discussions through the IAB Audio Committee and in their standards committees about how we might be able to approach this again. And I do think the landscape has changed. I think Spotify's product, which is more anchored around the actual play data, which is growing in scale as they grow, has changed the conversation and said, okay, it's possible there. How could we make it possible elsewhere? So
has Spotify increased that eagerness you were talking about?
they have very much increased that eagerness. I mean, that is the standard we wish we all could have.
Mhm.
And anybody who has a platform with reasonable scale can start to have that as well. So I think it's focused the conversations because it's shown that it's possible. The rest of it's all just safely handing data back and forth between parties, which happens all the time in the advertising ecosystem. So I will say I'm more optimistic than I've ever been that we'll get there. It's probably not going to be fast, probably going to be in a couple of years, but I think we'll get there.
When you say get there, where is there? Is it a common currency of data understanding? What is there?
I think there, in my mind, is a common language where you can transact business around play data where it's relevant, or download data if that's how you want to do it. But two different ways to approach the industry, and each would have its own place.
It seems to me that even with all this, that the advertising scene is getting more technically sophisticated all the time, and that buyers have more choice of what kind of ad they want, what kind of campaign they want to run. Host read, host pre-recorded, dynamically inserted, programmatic. There are these different campaign categories. So does that variety and that choice, how does that complicate your business, your revenue business?
I mean, it's always been that complicated, honestly. I'd say programmatic is new, but aside from that, it's always been fairly complicated. And I don't think that's changed between I'm speaking specifically about dynamic ad insertion versus the baked in ad component, which we've been selling both of those for a decade.
Yeah.
And the shift has definitely been happening over the last decade where dynamic has been growing, but there's still a large chunk of our business that's around baked in. And for us, baked in is just an easier way to do it and give a sponsor kind of 100% share of at least 4 weeks of publication. The other part that I think dynamic is driving, though, is audience targeting and audience sales. So, across our portfolio, the fastest growing segment of our business is being able to target, women 25 to 54 or some demography that is of high interest to a brand sponsor. Or
more like pure programmatic.
I would not call it programmatic because in my mind, programmatic goes all the way to the end of the chain, which is no ability to control the creative aside from blacklists and block lists. I would say that is the part that is the hardest for me to get square with in podcasting. Now, we are doing programmatic. I'd say we're on track to do a healthy 7 figures of programmatic business this year across the NPR portfolio. But it's, as my SVP of Ad Ops, Brett Robinson, says, programmanual, because everything about it can be programmatic up until the creative process where we still get a script, we approve a script, we voice the creative in our voice, and then we send it back to the buyer so they can traffic it on their system, because that is incredibly important to us.
That sounds like a public radio commercial placed into podcasting technology.
Yeah, I think our spots on the podcast side are definitely more liberal than the radio side, but I think we know from a decade of doing this that consistency in sound is extremely important both to our audience and to the performance for our sponsors. So, that for those two reasons, we guard this very carefully. And I think you can see it in some of the research that's come out this year. I think of Edison's super users study where, the people noticing that the ad loads have creeped up and that the ad quality has gone down, that's starting to eke up. And I would argue it's probably because people are not taking as much care about what ads they put into the show, and it may not sound like a podcast ad has sounded.
This is all quite interesting. Is there any way that programmatic advertising can lead into something I've heard of, which is called the Public Media Digital Audio Exchange? So I'm really looking for 2 answers. Can it benefit, and what the heck is that?
Yeah, so let's start with the what the heck is that first. So This is something we've actually been working on for a little over 2 years now. It kind of started as an idea for a podcast ad exchange across public media between NPR and stations and others in the ecosystem. And, any exchange is designed to solve one problem, which is there's always some inventory that goes unsold. You can pull all that together in a bigger pile, and then you can take that out to the market. And if you have enough, you can do it as a direct buy, a high quality buy with similar minded content. So the Public Media Digital Audio Exchange takes that idea, and we're adding in digital audio sponsorship as well. Things like, the 15 or 30-second spots ahead of on-demand content on a website or on a stream or on smart speakers. So the idea here is we want to work with all the stations under the NPR Network Initiative and take unsold inventory from across the entire public radio ecosystem, put it into an exchange that's organized by topics, but can also be sold by demography or geography, and then bring that to market, because we think that would be of interest to sponsors and advertisers who want to reach the public media audience. But instead of having to broker deals with NPR and a handful of stations, it's all one place where you can get it all. And that, I think, is going well. We've got our first half dozen stations signed up, and I hope to have way more signed up by the end of the year. Phase one is passive revenue. So NPM will be selling that and generating passive revenue for stations. But very excited for phase two, which hopefully is by the end of the year. Once we hit enough scale, we're going to have the stations be able to sell into it locally, which I think is a tremendous opportunity because they have relationships with a lot of local sponsors in their community who would have a hard time buying into the podcast space any other way. And through the exchange, they can have access to all of public media in their market and high quality podcasts. So we're very excited about this.
That sounds powerful. Is it a big technical build or really an organizational effort?
So that's where the programmatic part comes in. So we'll be using the AdsWiz stack for this, and all the tools that empower programmatic are the ones that we've kind of figured out how to put together to make this work. So I'm glad that programmatic is taking off, because now we have an infrastructure where we can actually do this, and we can support multiple ad servers. They all play pretty well together these days, from Triton to AdsWiz. So we're very excited about that. There is a system part to it as well. We have to convince the stations of the value. And I mean, I run a sales team. I know how it is. Ask any salesperson, do you need any help selling your inventory? You know what the answer is going to be? It's going to be no, it's all gone. But there's always some left over. So I think we've got to make sure the stations are comfortable that this isn't going to hurt their direct sales, and it's going to be an augment for them. And when we can get to the local sales opportunity, it's going to be a big benefit for them.
Well, you've sketched out some outcomes that you want over the next 8 years to 2030 for the new team, the growth team. Would you care to give me a prediction about podcasting more generally, either its revenue or its listenership or anything else in 2030, so that I can call you up in that year and say, this is what you said?
Oh, this is where I get in trouble, right? So I think we're at a very interesting moment in podcasting right now. And I've talked to a lot of my colleagues at different publishers. And I think the one thing I'm hearing across the board is it's harder than it's ever been to launch a show, and specifically to launch a show that becomes a good hit, right? I mean, I'll kind of roll back the tape 4 or 5 years. I mean, we could sort of make anything and put the NPR name on it, and we'd have 250,000 people download it in the first week. And I got to say, those days are kind of gone. I think that the saturation in the market, the amount of podcasts out there, you saw the latest Infinite Dial where the share has dropped. It's made it harder than ever. And the other thing that I think has changed is what we've noticed is within the Apple platform, when they debuted subscriptions, they kind of tweaked the behavior of how things work in the Apple Podcasts app and prioritize that subscription offering, which makes total sense. There's a revenue opportunity there. But the idea of following a show or like subscribing to a show is now kind of a second or third tier opportunity versus just play it and sample it. And that's had an impact on subscription numbers, which would drive the downloads and kind of the recurring content which subscriptions give. So I think we're in a new era for podcasting. I like to think of it as podcasting 3.0. I mean, if I go back into the eons, podcasting 1.0 was Planet Money, This American Life. It was Fresh Air. It was the shows that you kind of knew, and you're using this as a way to listen to them digitally, and maybe it came out once a week, and it was a nice treat. That lasted quite a while, and NPR did great in that environment. And see, about 5 years ago, we kind of noticed that trailing off, and we came up with what we call the daily habit strategy. And those led to things like Up First and Shortwave and Consider This, which are shorter, designed to kind of fit around the edges of your listening and create a daily habit for you, so that if you love science, you're just going to listen to Shortwave every day or any day you can. And that worked really well for the past 4 or 5 years. I think in this new environment, I don't quite know what is going to lead to success. I think paying a lot of money for a celebrity to come make a podcast doesn't seem like it's going to pay off in this new environment. I like to think of, I think success, and a lot of what we're trying to do with the NPR Network Initiative is become a publisher that can make way more stuff much more efficiently. And I think the benefit public radio has is we create lots of stuff every day for radio that is super high quality, right in the wheelhouse of podcasting. So as a system, if we can tailor what we do a little more on the radio so that it can be more easily repackaged and repurposed into podcasts, that feels like a winning formula for Podcast 3.0. And I got one example. We launched the Book of the Day podcast at NPR earlier this year, and it was an exercise in exactly this. We publish a lot of books content across all of our programs. And so every day we take a segment that was about a book. Maybe it's an author interview. Maybe it's an interview with or a review of a book. We do like 5 a day. So pick the best one, do a little work topic and tailing it, and then just automate it out as a podcast. And that is reaching almost 1 million people. And it was very efficient, and it serves a need in the market. So I think that's a kind of example of some of the things we think we can do across the network between local content and local arts content and what's happening in the community, which is a very underserved space in podcasting.
Yeah. Very interesting. All right. This is enlightening for me. It's been a great conversation. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to tell me about this initiative?
I think we covered all the salient points. I'm just very excited to see how we do with it. And, if we can achieve the goals we set for ourselves over the next 8 years, I think we've got a real chance of transforming public media for the next 50 years.
All right. I'll be very interested to follow along every step of the way. And in the meantime, thanks so much for coming on the show, Bryan. I really appreciate you making the time to do it.
Always fun. Thanks, Brad.
And that's all for this week's Podcast Business Lunch. Thanks to Bryan Moffett for making the time to do this. And many thanks also to our sponsors, without whose essential support, this series wouldn't be possible. Be sure to visit rainnews.com for more information about the Podcast Business Lunch, and also to watch past episodes, which you can do right on the website. While you're there, remember to subscribe, if you're not already, to the Rain Daily Digest newsletter. It is the leading trade publication for the online audio industry. I'm Brad Hill. Thanks for being here, and I'll talk to you next time.